We've had the International Monetary Fund come here for a couple of days, and they are speaking to a phase 2, as I believe you alluded to in your budget as well. What is the next stage as it relates to this phase 2, and on what will it hinge?
Thank you, David. First of all, let me thank you for asking me to do this interview. It was timely. I think I'm told that this is 51 days, not quite 100 days, but I think it's important to be able to have conversations periodically with the country, and that's what this is about. And I think I made you a promise that I would do this with you early on, and promise made, promise kept. With respect to the economy, as we said from day one, from the first day we were sworn in, we went straight to government headquarters and took a briefing from the central bank. And it became absolutely clear to us that we had to take immediate action. Indeed, there's a letter from January 2017 from the then governor of the central bank, Illaro, calling then for urgent immediate action to protect the country. And of course, 18 months passed and nothing happened. We were able, within 1 week, to make the determination that we had to suspend debt payments because it was our judgment that our debt is unsustainable, but that more importantly that we needed balance of payment support, because had we started to pay the foreign debt that we were due to pay in June, we were doing it against a background of increased oil payments and against the background of a risk of a hurricane season, and therefore we could well find ourselves with zero reserves before the end of the summer. In our view, urgent preemptive action was necessary. When we spoke to Madame Lagarde on the first Thursday, a week after, in fact the 31st of May, she recognized how urgent it was, and I want to publicly thank her for agreeing to send in a team within 3 days. We gave a commitment that we would need a budget to stop the bleeding, but that we would recognize that there would always be a phase 2 and a phase 3. And therefore the language of phase 2 and phase 3 in fact has its genesis with us in the budget that I gave on the 12th of June, because the first stage was always about the first 3 months. How could we literally remove some of the expenditure that was currently on the consolidated fund in order to be able to right size some of what we were spending. And we would do that effectively by cost recovery measures or user fees, recognizing that expenditure-related measures would take longer, and you couldn't do that in 3 months, realistically.
We've done well so far in backgrounding it, but you're yet to answer the question.
Well, because I'm giving the background, because as I said at the top, you jumped straight in. And I have learned that my communication is not going to be determined by you or anyone else, but by people's ability to understand what we are facing, and hence the context. And I think that's why you asked me to increase the length of the interview from 60 to 90 minutes just now.
I'm working with what I've been given.
No. You just told me 90 minutes, David.
Let us not spend time on that.
So let's not be focused on
Let's focus on the issue of what happens next.
And therefore, I'm not trying to get into any one-upmanship. So let's agree.
Neither am I.
Exactly. So let us agree that 90 minutes was what you asked for just now, and I'm working against that background. So that the concept of phase 2 came from us, and it came from us for the very reason that to do expenditure adjustment would need a phase 2 and a phase 3, because you can't so turn people overboard that they can't get things done. And the whole question of which entities, we have said as a government always that there are over 60 statutory corporations, and there's some government departments too, that we have to ask ourselves, can we do this the same way, in the way that we've done it all along? And we believe that we've been elected not just to reign from on high. That's not, we have to make decisions, but our decisions must be based on consultation with the people. And we've started that process with the social partnership throughout. And indeed, the phase 2 consultation started on Friday. We hope to go into the phase 2 consultations with the people of Barbados very shortly later this week. On Friday, when we met next door at Sherburn, I asked everybody in the social partnership to take a piece of paper and let's go through these entities. And let's have a simple key. What is essential? What is highly desirable? What is optional? And what is optional but can be better delivered elsewhere? So that people would then have had 4 things to choose from. I'm happy that I received that around lunchtime today, and it is clear where the consensus is emerging. But I do believe that we have a duty to go to the wider public, and I have asked the Ministry of Labour to be able to put that together with the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs with a paragraph or two on each entity, and let us have an electronic polling over the course of a week. We hope to be able to do that before the end of the week, so that the wider public of Barbados can weigh in and say, what do you see as essential for government to deliver? What do you believe is highly desirable? What do you believe is optional? And what do you believe is optional but can be better delivered? So that's the phase we're entering into now. Phase 3 is because even in that context, there are some that are going to be very lumpy and that will need probably about 18 months to be able to work through, 20 months to be able to work through.
Such as?
Water Authority, Queen Elizabeth Hospital. We're not going to play with the nation's health, and that's why we did the cost recovery with the health contribution taking 25%. But let's take the QEH in truth. QEH on average needs about $185 million a year. It's been getting about 145. On occasion it's gotten an increased amount, but for the most part for the last 10 to 12 years it has been under provisioned, predominantly. The cumulative deficit of that is over $500 million. And what we see is that of that 40% is owed either in trade payables to members of the private sector, to BRA, and to National Insurance Scheme. The rest of that adjustment has come in a dilapidated plant, in dilapidated equipment that's not always working in the best way, in shortage of supplies, in wear and tear on the staff that's working, so that there's a real cost to the under-provisioning. And when you consider the continuous kicking of the can down the road, you understand why we're here. And before I came just now, I went back to look at it. Studies were done. First of all, the last government spoke about doing it in 2012 to the Chamber of Commerce, to Parliament. In 2013, budget speech on the 13th of August. Studies were done by government itself internally, 2013 to 2014. Another study was done by PwC 2 years ago. Another study was done by the Fiscal Affairs section of the IMF in the last year or two. There's another one I have in my bag there done by the European Union, delivered last year. So that we've had 4 studies more or less telling us the same thing. In the meantime, the only thing that happens is that the situation continues to get worse and worse and worse.
Prime Minister, it is recognized that our resources are limited and that things have changed in this country. So far, there are those who would say it appeared as though on the campaign trail, there was a lot of criticism of taxation. The first thing that happens after you come to office is more taxes. And there's also a recognition that our social services need to be restructured. We can no longer continue with business as usual. Where is the sacrifice going to come? You say, or you appear to say, there will be no job losses. How are we going?
I haven't said that.
What are you saying there? Let's clarify.
I haven't said anything. You are now trying to get a context. What I'm saying to you is that phase 1 is gone. Phase 1 was about cost recovery in terms of shifting the burden and also in terms of user fees. Okay, our contributions. We've done that with the sewage and garbage and sewage collection, where we've said, look, everybody has to help stabilize this situation with sewage. We've done it with the health contribution fee, where we say, look, 25% of what the hospital needs and the polyclinics needs to come from what we will raise, which will raise in a full fiscal year just over $15 million. And we've said that tourism needs to be a public-private entity rather than just simply a public sector entity, but we will reduce the amount that it can function with, but get it from an independent source that has a contribution from persons coming to the island. And that's largely because the hotels themselves did not want us to carry back up VAT to 15% under a year because they have contractual obligations with tour operators and others, and we understand that. So that won't happen until January 1st, 2020. What we've said is that, look, adjustment has to be made. But the adjustment is not just in the cost recovery that we've announced already, but it now has to be made in terms of expenditure adjustment, not because we want to. And that's why I highlighted for you that the last government had 4 studies done between 2013 and 2017, but did not take a single step to do anything. So it has been left to us now to execute, because if we don't execute, people will suffer. And what is it that we're trying to save Barbados from? We're trying to save the value of our dollar, David. We're trying to make sure that when you go to buy a tin of corned beef in the supermarket, that instead of spending 4 something, 5 something now, that you won't have to spend $7 or $8 or $9, or similarly with other items that you have to buy that we don't produce locally. And I think that that is where you found a unanimity of approach with the social partnership, with the labor unions and with the private sector. And I want publicly to thank them, because I'm conscious that some people are trying to pillory them as if they're doing something unusual or improper in being able to recognize that the country is facing a national crisis. Where is the sacrifice going to come? We're going to have that conversation. And that's why I said we started on Friday. What's essential? What's highly desirable? What's optional? What can be optional but better delivered?
What's the timetable for that?
Within the next 4 to 6 weeks, we want to settle on the framework so that we can settle with the roadmap. If people have a roadmap, then we can set to work to make sure that even though there's going to be adjustment, we can minimize sufferation. And that's really what it is about.
But this is prior to the IMF agreement.
This is without prejudice to the IMF agreement. The IMF is happy that the government of Barbados is finally taking action. And in order to be able to, nobody's going to lend you money if they feel you're not serious. So that's the first thing. But are we doing all that we're doing because of the IMF? No, we're doing all that we're doing because in 1966, at the time of independence, this country had a number of statutory corporations that were introduced to be able to do things differently from how central government was done. There are many over the years, and not just in Barbados, but in the rest of the Caribbean, who have determined that a lot of these statutory corporations inherited the worst of government, the bureaucracy, but also the political interference which they were not supposed to have. So that we have to ask ourselves, what do we want government to do and how do we protect it? And in our Covenant of Hope, we set out for you and the public 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, what we believe should be the priority of claims on expenditure in assessing those questions of what government should be and what it should look like.
What is your sense of what the IMF is currently saying to Barbados as it prepares to work out an agreement with us?
They are patiently waiting our own economic recovery and transformation program. And we've said to them, we are not doing this for you, we are doing this for our own health. We know what we have to do to get healthy. We know what we have to do to make growth in this country sustainable. And my sense, David, Barbados must never reach this point again. Where we are is unfortunate. The fact that we have had to suspend debt payments, the fact that we have now to go through this comprehensive exercise. We have been operating on fumes, but the fumes out, the gas tank empty.
But I listened to a speech that you gave in St. James in 2017, May 2017, in which you said that it was possible for us to refinance without having to default or without having to have haircuts.
No.
I specifically remember the speech.
No. I've always said that we need to reprofile. And the reason why, David, let's give the public the background as to why you were the first interviewer too. Just before the election, you asked me this same question, and I told you that I felt as though I was hobbled, because to talk about what needed to be done on the eve of an election with respect to debt repayment is to effectively invite vulture funds to take Barbados' debt and to hold the country to ransom. Do you remember that? And I also said that what we needed to do was to reprofile. Now, the reason I use the word reprofile and not restructure is because in financial circles, restructure has a different meaning.
The word I heard was refinance.
And refinance is similar to reprofile, okay? But restructure implies default. And the restructure, and those who wanted to know why we announced it suddenly on the Friday, you don't give people advance notice of what you're going to do, because then you go and let them take precautionary action or preemptive action against us. Now, if we did that, Barbados would not be in a position to have the kind of discussions, and I don't want to get too much into it, because the discussions and negotiations are continuing. But we have to, this is not a case of liquidity, you know. This is a case of solvency. This is a case where we are the third most indebted country in the entire world. So let us get that clear and understand that the basis from which we are coming. Japan can finance itself and get its own way. Greece has the backing of the European Union. Barbados has neither. And if we continue to believe that we can spend more money in interest than we are spending on central government wages, then we are putting our heads in the sand. We spend $800 million this year on interest. We spend $780 million on central government wages. We spend $1 billion in amortization, and we spend effectively $1.2 billion in transfers to all of the statutory corporations.
Just let me clarify. Are you denying that you ruled out the notion of defaulting?
I don't know. I can't tell you.
Haircuts?
I can't tell you. I'd like you to show me, because I know that I hardly addressed the issue.
Because
and I certainly didn't address it in any of the budgets. I may have used words about refinancing because I deliberately stayed away from the word restructure.
Well, I recognize that you're dealing with that, but the more important issue would have been if you, as I recall, and I just researched it again.
But I'll do it again.
If you ruled out the idea of defaulting or haircuts
I didn't rule out the idea of defaulting.
time, then what would have changed between then and now? And if you say we're the third most indebted nation in the world, in 2017, where were we? Weren't we very close to that?
But David, with all due respect, I think you're trying to get a one-upmanship. Let's deal with the facts.
Why do you say that, Prime
Because
Minister?
you're trying to frame a conversation as false. Since 2014, David Eswick, Owen Arthur, myself, everybody except the then governor of the central bank, and indeed Chris Sinclair, agreed that Barbados needed to be reprofiling or refinancing its debt. We use the word refinance, majority of us, because there's a sensitivity to the word restructure. Refinance simply means lengthening the repayment terms and reducing the interest rate. I am saying that that's when you have a liquidity issue. Barbados's case is more than that. Barbados's case is a solvency issue. And to that extent, we could not use the word restructure or default before an election, because what it would have done was to cause vulture funds to go and take up and buy up Barbados's debt, hold on to it. Because we did not know what the terms of the debt were, because the government didn't share the information, we didn't know whether you had collective action clauses. In other words, would you be required to get unanimity in order to be able to reduce the amounts you have to pay, or could you do it on the basis of a majority of 75 or 80%? We now know those things, and we now know that we can move forward in this restructuring of the debt, because without that we can't get back. You ever say somebody cutting somebody with a dull knife? Cutting with a dull knife is more painful than doing surgery with a scalpel, which can cause you to walk within 2-3 days after you get past the gas pains. So that let us be clear that what this is about is not an interview between you and me. This is about the condition of a country. And I made it clear to you before the election. In fact, I completely remember I was at Turalcott a Saturday evening when I told you, David, I will give you the first interview because there are things that I am not going to carry this country to the brink on, even if it means that we lose the election. And we were very, very, very clear about that. Mercifully, we won the election, and mercifully, we've been able to take control and to be able to put things in place, because I don't want your children or your grandchildren to face this moment in time again. And because we've been able to do it with a relative sense of ease, everybody thinks it's hunky-dory. Barbados is in deep trouble. And we've had to be able to take a decision. How do we shift the burden of who carries it? Not just on the people who have traditionally carried it for the last 5, 6, 7 years. This last government tax, capital tax, earnings tax, land tax, everything. We have come in and said, no, you can't put any more burden in terms of taxation really there on those at the bottom. Those at the top, you got to carry and pay a little more corporation tax and a little more income tax. Those who come in and travel is discretionary. Pay a little bit at the airport. Because other countries in the world, and not just in Lucia, have that kind of departure tax or contribution towards departure on passengers, and it hasn't affected them. St. Lucia, Jamaica, Haiti, Dominican Republic, we can go on and on. Secondly, we put the room rate levy, and almost every other country. The Ministry of Tourism sent me a long list of countries. Last week we were in Jamaica. They charge a 10% GCT VAT and a 10% hotel service charge, as well as then a room rate levy. In the States, you're getting 15-20% charges plus then service charges by the hotel. So look, we don't do this because we want to, and we hope, and I said in the budget, that we will have comprehensive tax reform taken, because we recognize that some of the measures that we've had to use are not ideal, but are necessary to stop the bleeding. Let's deal with the road tax, because one of my ministers would have given the impression that if you put down the, what do you call it, your car, that you can literally not have to pay. And look, I have been very clear with the Barbadian public about being fair. And against that background, Cabinet on Thursday agreed that those, while he may have meant so that the police don't catch you, it was also equally capable of being understood that if you put it down, you wouldn't have to pay. And I've asked for the numbers are under $2 million. We've said, look, in fairness, let there be a refund for all who write the Ministry of Finance for the period of time between the 12th of June, which is the date of the budget, and the 30th of June, when the tax came to an end.
What will be the mechanics of that?
They'll just write a letter to the Ministry of Finance requesting a refund, as has happened in the past. If your car got in an accident and it was down for a month or two, invariably people would write the Ministry of Finance and ask that a proportionate part of their road tax not be payable because the car was off the road. We're saying that, look, we can't get into the details of who did and who didn't. Write the letter. We can check and see when your time came up at BRA. And once that's verified, then the government will give you back 75% of what you paid, and the government will retain 25% as an administrative fee. Similarly, with commercial vehicles, because they have the registration fee, instead of a refund, theirs will be applied to next year's fee, so they won't need to pay one next year. And it's minuscule in terms of the numbers of people on the commercial vehicles. I think it's less than 300,000.
But let me put in perspective for you, Prime Minister. In this circumstance here, it's about trying to put to you what are some of the issues that have come up along the way and put you in a position to address it. It really is not an attempt at one-upmanship here.
Just know it was.
As far as I'm concerned, okay? In that context, therefore, let us talk about size of your administration. You say you have inherited dire circumstances. How can you justify the size of the administration, the size of the cabinet to begin with, and other appointments which others have been questioning, for instance, Charles Young, and that? How do you justify that against the backdrop of the economic circumstances that prevail at the moment?
Thank you for asking me that. This manifesto, and I pulled for it, was unique in one major regard, not just domestically but regionally, our urgent agenda. And there were 17 mission critical items. And we didn't add CSME and CARICOM, we didn't add LIAT, we didn't add the Barbados Pharmaceutical Service.
These are the additional three that have been added as mission critical?
Yeah, they have since. I mean, we knew about CARICOM before, but we didn't feel that it should have been part of the domestic manifesto.
And what changed that?
Nothing changed it. We just didn't feel that we would put it in the domestic manifesto and LIAT, because it was just wider than domestic political matters. The point is that any two or three of these issues facing a government would have a government in trouble. The unique circumstances that we've inherited is that almost every sphere of economic, social, and governance in this country was under threat. And I remember using the phrase almost every day, many hands make light work. And in many hands make light work, I was simply sending the message that we need to be able to hit the ground running and to have as many activities on a parallel track as possible. Let's take the Attorney General and the Minister of Home Affairs. The Attorney General would normally be a Minister of Home Affairs in previous governments, but then they'd be responsible for 27 departments. In so being responsible for 27 departments, it would mean that they're all over the place and everything to everyone else. In the circumstances, I now have an Attorney General that can be responsive to put in the legislative framework that is critical to the economy, that is critical to the $1.9 billion in arrears that we have being negotiated down, that is critical to being able to deal with some of the egregious contracts that the government just does not have the fiscal space of being able to deal with. And that has to focus now also on getting the court system right, because the court system is one of the biggest drags now on economic development. Similarly, we decided that we wanted a Ministry of Maritime Affairs and the Blue Economy because we recognized that we needed to hit the ground running, and thank God for that with the sargassum weed, with the turtles, with a number of other things that we have to build out with the cruise port. And I'll talk about that, remind me to talk about that later in the interview about where we are with cruise, because we are going to face a date with Destiny soon in another 2 years. But by having those segregated, it means that we can hit the ground running in those. By having a separate Minister of Science and Innovation and Technology, what's the biggest complaint of people? That government is living in the 20th century in an analog environment, and that the rest of Barbados operating in a digital environment. All of us don't know what to do without this. So that we recognize that we needed to have separate people. As it relates to the other persons who are not ministers, let's deal with Mr. Jong. The Prime Minister's office has staff, and I've indicated that I wanted somebody who can deal with not just my communications to the rest of the country, but my communications within government. Now, David, you know, I asked for all the consultants that were hired by the last government, and this is the list of them. I'm not going to be invidious, but let's start and say that I'm prepared to be judged by performance. I'm not going to talk about the fact that in the Prime Minister's office there were persons being paid to be a special events promoter, and I've never seen special events from the last Prime Minister, perhaps other than the monthly tourism thing here.
Comparative costs that people will be looking at.
But what's the comparative cost?
I don't know.
Well, let's deal with the comparative costs.
Not for one person, but I mean overall.
So let's deal with them.
Prime Minister's office.
Let's deal with them. Because the majority of posts in the Prime Minister's office are not filled. And let's deal with the fact that the former General Secretary of the Democratic Labour Party, look at it here. You can read it yourself. I don't want to get into calling it on things that we haven't even started, David. The truth is that we haven't even come close. In the Prime Minister's office, there was one on social poverty alleviation, there was one on special events, there was the former General Secretary of the Democratic Labour Party being paid far more. In fact, almost 50% more than Mr. Jong is going to be paid. I have a personal aide, and Mr. Jong in there so far, but let me tell you how I did it. I also asked that they freeze the Director of Communications post in Home Affairs, and in fact, he hasn't even been paid a cent yet, because I've said I want him on a contract, because when I go, he goes. This is not a case of putting somebody in the public service, but this is a case of recognizing that I need to be able to manage communications. Right now, you know when I got internet in the Prime Minister's office? A few days ago. Now, how do you communicate to a country? How do you communicate to other departments within you? I have literally about over 15 other departments that I've got to communicate with. Unfortunately, Mr. Jong has a degree in design engineering and process engineering in addition to the communications. Let's deal with the other special advisors, because I'm going to deal with this once and for all today. Okay? This government has determined that because we had the largest exodus of public servants retiring early in the last 10 years, that there is a huge information deficit and expertise deficit that we have to close. On the question of the South Coast and energy and environment and water, I've asked that Dr. Seeley be engaged. Now, I want to pick this back up again because these people are being engaged.
How many documents you have in that bag then?
Enough for you. It's the red bag, so don't worry about it. It doesn't go because the election has gone. But the Ministry of Agriculture, look at it. There are people here managing entities that are costing the government $25 million a year in losses and subsidies, but being paid more than any of these special advisors that I'm being asked. And there are about 5 of them that we've asked to come in to help us right size from a technical perspective. Dr. Hugh Seeley, and all of them, by the way, have regional, international, and international expertise. Dr. Hugh Seeley was involved in the Paris climate change matters, and we can't afford to pay them full time. So what do? We're giving them and have brought them in at S2 levels, less than others who are being paid, and in circumstances where I know that the public of Barbados is going to see what they delivered in a way that I can't say so for a whole host of them whose names I will not be invidious and call, but starting with those who made my life and your life miserable on WhatsApp on a morning when he was being paid $7,000 from Invest Barbados and $5,000 from the Barbados Tourism Authority. We've also asked Dr. Annalie Babb to come in because she is one of the foremost experts on digital technology. Her doctorate is on technology for small island states, and she served as a member of the Sultan of Oman's Scientific and Research Council. I've asked Ben Arundel, who, as we know, served on the UN Global Tax Expert System, and at a time when the country, not just Barbados, but also other countries in the region are facing blacklisting from the OECD and the EU with respect to the quality and nature of our product in the international business and financial services sector. I've asked Professor Avinash Prasad, who has served at the highest levels globally with respect to in Europe and in Singapore and in India, working with their different central banks and their different ministries and addressing the Congress and addressing G20. So these are people who will add value. And I've asked a youngster by the name of Jonathan Reed, who has done significant work in the region, working with another ministry in the Caribbean with young and youth policy. And also, I think he was responsible for the restructuring and the repurposing of the communication of a major national newspaper that I think you may know well. So these are not people that we've taken from the side of the road. And these are people whom we will allow to be held accountable. But you know what I find amazing? That I've just shown you a whole file full of stuff. We didn't make it an issue because we were too busy focusing on the substance of what that government was not doing. Because we have so focused on getting this country and working this country back from the brink, there's no substantive issues to concern yourself with, but people are picking now at the side and edges. Well, I am prepared to be accountable for the progress and for the results of my government. And I've said so, in fact, to the ministers. I've said that each of them must be accountable, that this is not a free ride for anybody, that their work will be reviewed, that they must be humble, that they must be caring, and that they must be remembered always why we came to government and what we were elected to do. And I want to make sure that we can give young people and other people in this country opportunities. This is the judgment that we're making as to what is necessary. I realize that there are some people, particularly in your profession, who have an axe to grind, and quite frankly, they were making those comments for the last decade for the most part, and they will continue to make them. But
I think
that is life.
At the core of this, though, is trying to satisfy a substantial number of people out there that, while on the one hand, Barbadians are being asked to sacrifice more taxes, more fees, and our creditors have also been asked to make a sacrifice. It does not appear as though the government's bureaucracy itself is insensitive to those concerns. That's the critical issue. And let me say to you that in that context, people talk about the fact that in the United Kingdom, there are 23 members of cabinet. In Barbados, there are now 26 plus 2 ambassadors that can attend cabinet meetings. You speak about the challenges that we face, but if you took Britain as an example, Brexit and all, they certainly have a lot of challenges.
Well, you know,
as
David,
well.
the problem is that you must define what you mean by
population.
You must define what you mean by cabinet too, because in Britain there are ministers underneath there. In Jamaica and in Trinidad, they also have large cabinets. We have to understand that the complexity of governance in these countries has changed. I just indicated to you that I could have kept larger ministries. The price of larger ministries is that we would not be able to satisfy the mission critical objectives. And as I said to you, the difference is that I'm prepared to be judged by performance. I'm not so sure that others have. When you take up literally the fact that if you understand, I've served in social sector, I've served in economic sectors, and I've served in governance. And I know that I need to deliver in every single one of these areas to save this country and to save other people from literally coming to the brink. You have a situation, let's deal now with the last few days. There's a conversation that we have to have with the country, and that the Minister of Youth Affairs, along with the Minister of Home Affairs, along with myself, have to start having. We've had some gun incidents last week, 2 of them. This morning, I was sent a video this afternoon from a fete that took place that had some people running lawless. It has to stop. And in order for us to do that, we have to put in the time and go and engage. This is not a case of being able to use the heavy arm of the law on people. This is a case of sitting down and talking with people and putting structures in place.
How exactly do you propose to do that?
Because I think that the Ministry of Youth Affairs has to put back in place substantive programs that take young people. A large part of the problem is people between the ages of 14, 15 and 22. You talk to older people in the community. We used to do programming, spend $5 million a year in programming. Immediately on the last government being elected, they took that and put it in summer camps, Christmas camps, and Easter camps. 3/4 of that $5 million then came to be spent in catering and not in programming. Unless you have young people in structured activity, the devil is going to find work for idle hands. The other problem, and I've said it frankly, that there are 2 things that give me pause every day and at night. The threat of a hurricane, because God knows we can't take that now, or a storm, and that's why last weekend we praised God that it didn't happen. And secondly, automatic weapons, automatic guns. Because those things that might have caused people to get in a fight years ago, and they might have used a piece of 2x3, they might have cuffed one another, they might even have used a knife. The chances of recovery from that are huge. The chances of recovery from being able to be felt and shot with an automatic weapon that is putting out how many bullets a minute? Minuscule. So we have to get on top of it. We have to have the conversation. I remember speaking to one of the older people in the community who said to me, that the youngster said, you imagine I shoot him and he play that he dead? Now how do you play that you're dead? If you use a gun that has bullets, you can't play that you're dead. The chances of the person dying are fairly substantial. So that I've put Adrian Ford there as Minister of Youth Affairs and Community Development because he has an extremely good rapport with young people and has been able to turn a lot of young people in Silver Hill and Gall Hill, long before becoming an MP, into entrepreneurs and dealing with community entrepreneurship, etc. I've put Cynthia Ford to deal with elderly affairs because what is our biggest problem in this country, David? We have an aging population and we have people that are being neglected. We have older people that are being left at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital as if the Queen Elizabeth Hospital was a geriatric hospital. And we need to be able to come to terms as to how we take care of our elders in this country in a dignified way. We're about to create a population commission because Barbados needs to ask itself and come to grips. Is our population large enough to sustain the quality of life that we have? Probably not. So that the Ministry of Health has been asked to bring a paper so that we can determine what is the appropriate size for our population in the next 50 years if we are to sustain our quality of life in Barbados. So, as I said, David, I'm prepared to be judged on performance on these matters. One thing I know is that it will be transparent. And the notion that I can come into government and find all kinds of consultants in the Ministry of Tourism, the Ministry of International Transport, Invest Barbados, the Prime Minister's Office, the Ministry of Public Works, the Ministry of Transport, I can give you chapter and verse on all because it comes into millions of dollars. What I've asked the country to bear in terms of additional ministers of government, all of whom I voted for, is less than $1 million. And in terms of the 5 special advisors that we are bringing on board, we believe that they add value, and equally they are less than 750,000 when you add the 5 by that. So if that's what people want to spend the time on, so be it. But I know this, that my commitment is to the majority of people who want to make sure that they can continue to enjoy the quality of life that we've enjoyed all our lives, and which is at risk because a previous government, 1, refused to take action, 2, spent the money in things that we don't want to talk about this evening because we'll be here all night. 3, did not do and focus on getting the kind of linear approach and strategic approach to bring Barbados into the 21st century, indeed the third decade of the 21st century. Tomorrow, I go to have a town planning consultation. Legislation passed the year I was born, and while I might like to feel that I'm young, the truth is that I've been around 52 years, and so has that legislation. So we've got to bring it into the 21st century.
So Prime Minister Mottley, you spoke about the efficiency of government trying to get things done. You have been on the campaign trail, and you have been talking about the team that you brought, a mix of experience and youth. But a couple of decisions that have been implemented seem to some people to be hasty and not so well thought out. You just alluded to one. You spoke about the issue of the double taxing of road users, as some people saw it. Then there was the question of the confusion over the removal of the NSRL as it relates to customs. It reached a point where Ryan Strawn explained at a news conference that initially it was expected that goods that had arrived before July would be subject to the 10% levy, but then that was changed. And yet another one which comes across that way is the fact that you had to adjust the Constitution to accommodate the 2 senators. And to that extent, the question arises, are you not necessarily being more hasty while you're trying to hit the ground running?
They're teething problems, David. I mean, the bottom line is, and I explained in the case of William's statement, Minister Duguid's statement, that may be capable of misinterpretation. We also have to come to realize that there will always be a point in time when people will feel hard done by taxation. Those who paid their fees in April and May will feel hard done still, but there has to be a line drawn in the sand. With respect to the NSRL, fundamentally that had to do with a misunderstanding with respect to the programming of the system as I understood it, and indeed that was eventually dealt with. I think that so many people were going on at one point that it crashed the system for 2-3 days, and that was dealt with. So there will be teething problems. Look, a government is not an exam where you score 100%, you know. A government is about doing the right thing for people in the best way that you know possible. With respect to the constitutional amendments, I made it clear. I would never have thought, and I don't think that any of us thought, that people born in Barbados would be precluded from being able to serve in Barbados, largely because of the fact that they had a second form of citizenship. And they had a second citizenship because of their children's citizenship. Now, in cases where their children are minors, I think it would have been a little much to ask people to give up that second citizenship, because suppose something happens to a child, and suppose they have to rely on that child accessing some special form of medical care where they're living. That would be difficult. And quite frankly, we felt that the section of that part of the Constitution was egregious, even with respect to the other part of it in terms of residency, where the Governor-General herself in one of her appointments needed it too. So I would not say that we were being hasty, but I accept that whether we are being hasty or slow, there will always be teething problems in the initial stages because there's a learning curve to government. Friday, I was explaining to others some of the things that they need to look for with respect to posts that may be vacant and posts that are temporary as opposed to established, that most people in government, quite frankly, unless you've been around a long time, don't know. But what's the difference? The difference can be the double accounting and whether our deficit is higher or smaller. So it's fundamental at this time of the year, but most people don't know about it.
The Parliament has just passed the integrity legislation.
No, not yet. It's
about to be passed.
No. The debate is still open, and I suspect we are going to go to a select committee to take commentary from the people of Barbados, because we feel that they ought to have a say at least for 4 to 6 weeks.
The commentary from the people of Barbados in select committee.
How we've done it in the past before. We did it with pre-deal larceny, we did it with road traffic, we did it with family law. You create a joint select committee of both houses, and people can come and write, and in some instances come and give oral evidence. But we want to be able to do it quickly, so that by the time we come back by the end of summer, that we're in a position to make sure that the legislation has stopped. What we have asked is that for ministers to declare their assets and to have those assets sealed and put in a special safe until the Integrity Commission is being done in most instances. There's some instances where accounting things, but I would imagine that before the end of this month, all will be in.
What are the big challenges with this?
Nothing. I mean, in some instances, people particularly would have had to get accountants to sign off and different things like that. So, I mean, look, we've never had a cabinet of Barbados declare their assets to anybody, other than you had me declare it from opposition benches. But we've never had a cabinet do it. And we feel fundamentally that this is an important step for us to make as a country. Because, look, the cost of corruption in the last decade in particular, cost of corruption at all times, but in the last decade has been significant. You know, one of the things that we've had to do is to sit down with people and to get people to recognize from all walks of life that if we don't spend money here, if we spend money here, we can't spend it there. And that government is fundamentally about choices. And those choices mean that we have to work out, can we really afford for contracts to be issued arbitrarily and wantonly, and are we being fair? I mean, I've spoken about the fact that a global concession, was given for our ports for 30 years, for $34 million US, and for one out of every $6 that we currently receive now, and perhaps one fifth of any future increase. Now that is given away Barbados's port and cruise market, and we're not going to do that.
Right here. What's going to happen to those scenarios where there is clear proof and evidence that things were done in the wrong way? Because there's a lack of mistrust on the part of many people who believe that politicians say one thing in opposition, but when in government, they don't touch their friends.
Well,
that's one part of it.
It's not about friendship. I've said, and the Attorney General spoke last week, and where there's evidence, evidence will take its course. In some instances, there will have to be a case of us negotiating to protect the public fiscal space. And let's be real about this. The government of Barbados' word can't just be walked away just so. And what we've tried to do is to call in people where we feel that they're lumpy, egregious contracts that cannot be sustained, and ask people to walk away from them. Because if you now have to take on $200 million here, $500 million there, $300 million there, David, you can kiss everything goodbye. And that's exactly what was beginning to happen.
Can you be any more specific about the types of contracts that are in that position?
Yeah. I mean, verse 6 at the port, we've said, look, walk away from this contract because we don't believe that it started well and that we don't believe we can afford it. The sugar factory, that was $400-500 million. We said, look, this is unsustainable, can't be done. There are a few more that we are going to be working on in the next few weeks, and I don't want to prejudice it because it literally means that what the country is going to be asked to pay from those three contracts is the equivalent of $100 million more a year in circumstances where we can't afford it. But at the right time, I'll come back to you and report on those other two in the same way that I'm telling you about the ones that I've just mentioned. There were others that are less in amount, but contracts signed on the eve of an election, where you're leasing out space to people that really and truly ought not to have been the subject of that kind of lease, because it wasn't advertised to anybody else to be able to have a chance on public property. And our government has said, look, there are a couple of things that we feel strongly about. Where the government is offering public patrimony, particularly in the capital city of our country, we have to carry along people. We have banks now that are giving people 0.1% interest on savings. So the opportunity for people to earn money back. In fact, you're really paying the bank to keep your money there. And we feel that if we are going to give the ability to somebody to make money off of a government decision, then there has to be some portion of the share ownership that is left for the public to be able to invest in, either as equity or indeed as debt instruments, and for credit unions and for pension funds. Because if we don't create these opportunities for Barbadians, who will?
But creating those opportunities is one thing. What the banks are doing, though, it seems as though we're powerless.
Well, at the end of the day, it's not a case of powerless. It's a case that that's what the market is bearing. The last government removed the minimum deposit savings rate. We are going to
change that?
Let me get through the issue of dealing with the whole question of the debt restructuring before we have other conversations. It's too early for us to begin to say so. Right now, David, as I said, I want us to focus on the fact that we need to get the debt restructuring completed and to get the IMF program in place to support the balance of payments on a parallel track to what we do to repurpose and restructure government, not for anyone else but ourselves, so that the next 50 years are secure. But we accept that the opportunity for Bajans to be able to get a return on savings is not there. And rather than fight with the banks at this stage, we are saying that we're going to create some opportunities that allow you to be able to get a return, so that if there are projects that need to raise money, that they can raise them from a bond from Bajans so that they can get back their money, or that they can participate in equity. So that, let's take the Hyatt, because I think Mr. Comijong has already made the point that we've started a conversation. The government is clear that there has to be the full aspects of the environmental impact assessment completed, as he has gone to court to argue for. And that will include making sure that there's a social impact assessment, a heritage impact assessment, that we look at the impact on sewage, especially now with the Bridgetown sewage system where it is, and the outflow for that, whether it hooks back up to Bridgetown or where it goes. And then also the question of the impact of piling, depending on the height of the building, and what will the impact be on the church and the Empire Theatre and other buildings. So those things have to be done, but they have to be done quickly. Had the government before sought to put all of the studies in place, then there would have been no basis for a court case. But apart from all of those other things of the studies...
Before you go on, are our hands tied in any way as it relates to Hyatt, though? Even though those studies weren't done?
They have a permission from the previous Prime Minister. But we've said to them that as far as we're concerned, you're going to be tied up in court for the longest time if you don't do the studies. So you have a commercial decision to make. You could as well do the studies, because you run the risk that the court might say that the studies are necessary. And that, left to me, I would advise you, do the studies, get them out of the way. If there are issues that preclude it, then you know up front. If there are issues that can be addressed but allow you to proceed with the investment, then equally you know up front. But what we have said is that given that the Harbour Police site was a critical part of one of the sites that was acquired in order to build it, that we feel strongly that you have to carry along a part of the population with you. And that whether it is, I can't remember if it's 25 or 30% of the investment, needs to be made available to the Barbadian public so that they too can participate in an investment if it makes sense.
That raises the question of the whole concept of divestment, because we anticipate that this will be part of what would come out of all the discussions we are having right now.
Yes and no. I mean, divestment in different ways. The tourism, BTMI and BTPA is a form of divestment, public-private partnership. There will be some other divestment down the line, but what we're trying to focus on initially are those things that have a recurring budgetary claim on public expenditure. Because if I go and sell a one-off asset, as the last government was trying to do with BNTCL, that helps me this year, but it doesn't help me next year. So that there's some structural difficulties that we need to deal with. Having said that, there are some entities, and for the very reasons, one, wanting to broaden the base of participation of ownership, that we feel that Barbadians, in addition to being taxpayers or fee payers to an entity, may want to be shareholders. And I think you and I have discussed in the past, many years ago, that the corporate governance in the first place improves if you have a broader base of ownership of the entity, and that things that people will put up with, regrettably, as a taxpayer, they're not going to put up with as a shareholder. So it makes sense to look at it in some respects like that. But secondly, that in divestment, that we also make sure that there is not a consolidation of ownership by any 1, 2, 3 or 4 people, so that you may have to cap. And the Barbados Labour Party in the past has put an approach to the public to divestment, which we still support fundamentally, that we look at pension funds, credit unions, individual shareholders, and that we cap to make sure, particularly in certain classes of shares. But we recognize that we may have to partner with people strategically, either in shareholding in order to be able to carry it to the next level, or keep the ownership local but divest management. It depends on the particular entity. So there are different options, but the one thing I give the country the assurance is that we will always have the conversation, because we see ourselves as only holding trusts for the people of the country.
Let's talk a little bit about the ease of doing business.
Yeah.
And at the center of all of this is the court system of this country. The very fact that we now have courts sitting all over the place because a relative new building is not good enough makes life exceedingly difficult. While we have to deal with the physical component of that, there is the other part of the infrastructure in there that is of deep concern to Barbadians. What assurances can you give us about how your government is going to set about trying to tackle that problem?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I have a separate Attorney General and a separate Minister of Home Affairs. And that's why I said I'm prepared to stand by our performance. Look, let's deal with the building first. What has happened with the building is regrettable. This is a case of no maintenance taking place sufficiently.
Only?
Primarily.
Nothing went wrong with respect to the construction of it?
Not to my knowledge. If there has, it hasn't been brought to my attention. What has been brought to my attention are things that can be dealt with but haven't effectively come with the chillers and different aspects of what happened then with the environmental degradation thereafter. We've given them $2.5 million in the budget, as you know, in order to fix the problem, and we hope that once that problem is fixed, that we'll all come back there. But we have a problem in this country with maintenance and buildings. It's the same with other buildings across the country, and that's why I've given Minister Duguay the title of Public Works, Transport and Maintenance. And we've committed, and I'm insisting on it, that we create, as we restructure government, we are going to allow government to do the things that government really ought to do, rather than being all things to all people, and rather than being nothing to anybody. So what is it that we must do? We need to deal with maintenance properly of government buildings in this country. And I'm using the example of what we do with debt. We create a sinking fund to make sure that we can start to pay back. We feel that by law, we should require a sinking fund to be created, and 1.5% of the cost of any new building go into the sinking fund every year in order to be able to make sure that we can do the appropriate maintenance so that this syndrome of sick buildings can become a thing of the past. With respect to the actual functioning of the court system, our manifesto is very clear and very ambitious in what we're asking for. You asked me what are some of the things we will do with the problems that we're having now in the community. One of the first things that needs to happen is that when people are charged, they must come to court and have their cases heard quickly, particularly for the serious offenses: murder, burglary, robbery, rape, kidnapping, the major ones. And we feel that that time period should be no more than 6 to 9 months, and that thereafter every period should be no more than 9 months to each appellate stage. In fact, I really feel 6, but let's say 9 months. So that effectively from charging to the final appellate stage should absolutely be no more than 2 years and 3 months. That's what we want to work towards. We've also given the Attorney General some money to deal with the backlog of criminal cases. You have a backlog of 10,000 criminal cases. A lot of people who are walking about Barbados who still give in trouble are people who otherwise are before the courts for other things. So we need to deal with that expeditiously.
But what causes all of that backlog?
What causes it?
Yes.
Because the systems have just literally been archaic. We have the same magisterial district system that we had in 1950-something, in spite of population increases and shifts. We have rules that make no sense, that you hear me say all the time, and we're going to talk about it in respect to town planning tomorrow, but it touches every area of government, to deconstruct and to reconstruct. What is the public interest we're serving with this rule? What is the public mischief we're trying to solve? Can technology allow us to do something more efficiently than we're currently doing, which we know it can in most instances? And are there social justice issues that have to be addressed, either in terms of getting away from discrimination or a platform for enfranchisement?
Do we have to address how we appoint some people to key posts?
We may in respect to some of the things. I mean, I have no issue with changing on the appointment of judges. I did it for the Caribbean Court of Justice. So that is something that I know that the Attorney General and I will be having a conversation on shortly. But more importantly than even that is the changing of the rules. And what is it in terms of pretrial disclosure, in terms of case management? We need a separate commercial court. We've committed to a separate family law court, so that this notion of one court for mothers who are single mothers and coming for maintenance money is different from those who are married and who go in the High Court in the air conditioning. All of those things I've asked the Attorney General to start so that we can fundamentally change. And then this thing about giving people criminal convictions for every breach of every offence makes no sense. We need to move to civil penalties. We need to move to more community service activities. If you're prepared to destroy the social capital, then you got to be prepared to build it back. So I am comfortable and confident that I have an Attorney General who will deliver on these issues and who will make a fundamental difference to the functioning of our court system over the course of the next 4.5 years. You know, David, I talking to you here, and it's difficult to recall that we've only been in government less than 50 days, 50 days.
But you hit the road running.
Yeah, and I want to hit the road running. You know why? Because I know what it is like to be in government for 14 years. And I know how fast 14 years goes. And I feel that the people of this country deserve an opportunity to be able to have the best possible life that they can. That has been taken away from us in the last decade. And unless we forget, that's what we are fighting to stave off. So,
Prime Minister, update us on the mission critical issues. Sewage project, where are we with that?
On the sewage project, we've been able to stabilize a lot of the immediate things. I think what's the most compelling picture of the last 51 days? I think the picture of those Bridgetown sewage tanks that had the trees, feet and feet of trees growing up in the tanks, and then within less than a week or two later, the tanks being absolutely clean. With respect to the South Coast, they think that they have identified some areas where there's some breaks in the force main, but in addition to that, the deep injection wells are taking the sewage. They're asking people to reduce the fats and the oils and the grease, and they have a standard operating set of procedures that are working for the most part.
But the long-term aspect of it?
The long-term aspect is going to require that we build the second marine outfall out beyond the reefs, and we're having discussions about that now with the technical players. Dr. Seeley hasn't started formally yet, and that's one of the reasons why we need him on board to be able to help us with wading through a lot of the technical issues there.
What's the ETA on that?
But on him or on
that aspect of it?
I reckon that within the next few months we'll know what specifically we will sign off on the marine outfall, which carries it off there by the sluice gate, but beyond the bank reefs. And the coastal engineers are looking at that and the tidal movements, I'm told. Secondly, you have to decide whether you're going to upgrade or whether you're going to build a new tertiary treatment plant. And I think you and I had this conversation one day on the radio about that, and I haven't had a final sign-off on that. But in fairness, their immediate objective was to be able to bring the immediacy of the horror to an end, and for the most part they've done it. When we thought we would have the storm last weekend, they made determinations to open the sluice gate and to be able to lower the levels, and they've been doing that. I think the beach is still closed for another few days to facilitate that. And there will be work done on trying to ensure that Graham Hall swamp itself, the areas where there's 4 or 5 feet of sewage and sludge, it's not good. So they're in the process of doing all of that. Are we at the point of saying mission accomplished with the short term? No, we're not. Are we in good shape on the fact that we are on course to fixing it? We're still on course to fixing it, yes. And thank God we've not seen the horrors of it on the road as was the case in the past. And on a parallel track, we will be making the sign-off on the outfall and on the actual upgrade. We have to make decisions on Bridgetown too, and as I said, Hyatt and other hotels, because Massey, for example, has other properties there on the pier head, and that's why the conversation even on the height of buildings becomes real, because the entities that they were talking to wanted to build hotels that were 20 stories high. So look, these are difficult conversations that the people of Barbados must have and will have, and tomorrow we start it by bringing all the private and public planners together, streaming the conversation, and giving people over the next 4 to 6 weeks an opportunity to participate. Of course, the third one is the West Coast. And why the government is committed to dealing with all 3 of these, our reefs have died, a lot of them. And we are committed to rebuilding our reefs. When last did you step on a cobbler? When last did you use some candle grease to take a cobbler from the bottom of your foot? Your children and grandchildren will not know the joys of that. But more importantly, the costs of the reefs dying to our coastal economy and to our way of life and to the kinds of fish that you will catch are tremendous. And ironically, when I was talking to you about the blue economy earlier, the Caribbean Development Bank has just brought out almost a 200-page study on financing the blue economy. At CARICOM Heads of Government meeting, most of the heads were very complimentary about the fact that Barbados is taking the lead in the establishment of recognizing that we have to exploit and manage our resources appropriately in the blue economy. We can't do that if we have marine outfall that is bad, and equally, and that's why the long-term thing requires, in my view, some level of upgrading to tertiary treatment at the end of the day. And if we have agricultural runoff too, which is also another consideration.
The garbage trucks and the buses.
Trying to get them. Bottom line is a procurement process. I've said to the Ministry of Finance officials, and I think they all agree, that we need to go into sovereign leases. When you seek to own things...
What does that mean?
One, that it allows us to be able to lease without it going into debt. And two, that there will always be a cost and a replacement cost always. And we need to have a rolling stock. This notion that
you need to define the term sovereign lease.
Sovereign lease means that the government leases it, that's all. Okay, but ultimately there are other conversations that I want to have with those entities and the workers, but I need to speak to the social partnership first before going into any greater detail today on it. But suffice it to say that the government recognizes that it has to be able to lease rather than buying some. You may decide to buy your car outright, in which case you take on a debt, or you may decide to lease it. There's some who might argue that leasing of cars in Barbados is not the same as leasing in developed countries, and that's true, and it's something we have to look at. But the sovereign leases recognize that there's a cost for the transport element of it, or the plant and equipment end of it, and that we will continue to pay for it. The perfect example is police vehicles, and buses and trucks too. Instead of trying to replace all at once, let's do a few every year so you have a rolling stock replacement. But this notion, and that's what I mean by short provisioning people, because the Transport Board was getting 20, 30, and in some years $40 million less than what it needed. You then have a situation where you move from 250 buses to 60, 70 buses. Now at the same time, you can't run a country. People need access to affordable and reliable buses in order to get to work. And while I'm at this, let me use this opportunity to say that I've asked and agreed that the others, the minibus and the commercial operators have asked to see me since I've come back a few days ago. I've said, look, let's meet with them next Friday. If they have a case to make, I want to hear it. And if the case is reasonable, then the country will also hear it. But what we're not going to agree is to strand any form of investment or any form of entity out there, in the same way that we won't do it to Light and Power, and we won't do it to Water Authority or to any of the other entities, the banks, the insurance companies.
Taxi drivers are also complaining.
Taxi drivers, I'm talking about all commercial vehicles, PSVs, taxi drivers, etc. And I think I mentioned to you earlier that with respect to them, or did I? While the others will get a 75% rebate for people who paid between the 12th of June and the 30th of June, commercial vehicle operators who paid because their registration fee comes up next year again, they will just get next year's waived rather than having to pay. And I think that's less, I did tell you, because it's less than $300,000 worth of fees there. But we will meet with them. I know they've been making a case for an increase in bus fares for the last 2.5 years. I can assure you the nonsense that was paraded around WhatsApp for $5 increases far from anything in the government's head. But they have to make a credible case, and a credible case will be listened, because your organization will not agree, and I think you now manage it, so you know, will not agree to becoming a perpetual loss-making entity, as will no other private sector entity. So I think there has to be a sensitivity to their plight. We'll listen to it, but at the same time we are going to be conscious that if we have to take care of those who are at the margins, and in a sense, when you said that we gave with one hand and took back with the other hand, that's a very glib and rough and crass way of saying what we did. I recall to you what I told Madame Lagarde and others, that if you ask people to go on a long journey, you have to give them breakfast. You have to make sure that they're fed and capable of the long journey. We're asking Barbadians to go on the longest journey since independence, not because I want them to, but this is what we've inherited. And we've inherited it in a way that I feel that we are equal to the task. But in being equal to the task, I feel that we have to give our people the ability to stand up like men and women and to help lift some of the weight that has to be done.
The question of the role of Auditor General and the role of the Public Accounts Committee. The latest Auditor General's report is out.
Yep.
And in many respects, it is more of the same. And the question arises in the eyes of many people, how can we make a difference here? What can this new government do to make us feel that there's a greater sense of accountability when it comes to the issues that are raised time and time again in the Auditor General's report?
Well, one of the things that we want to do, and you talk about not wanting to rush, this is one of the areas in which research is being done to see how best we can require ministries to account publicly by statute, and rather than they may or they may not answer with respect to the Auditor General. Because even with the best will in the world, Public Accounts Committee led by the Leader of the Opposition may never be able to address all of the issues which are referenced in the Auditor General's report. We just did housing. I mean, we could have done Water Authority, we could have done SSA, we could have done NCC. There was a whole range of them. So that the obligation has to go beyond that of the Public Accounts Committee investigating. It has to be that if you have been found or negatively referenced, then you have to report back to Parliament. There are some countries who require even more. The bigger issue for us is not producing annual reports. And I've been discussing with the Director of Finance that in some instances we may have to meet with the Accountant General and others and determine a line in the sand and then start from fresh moving forward. Because the truth is that in many instances we're being told that a lot of the data that's necessary is not there. So we feel we can strengthen the obligations on departments and ministries to respond in a substantive way to the Auditor General. We are dealing with some of the issues because remember a large part of his report relates also to the backlog, the arrears. And as I indicated, the arrears that we found were staggering, almost 19% of GDP. Now some of it is arrears owed within government, and therefore you can literally see how you can write down some of those. But so the Auditor General's role is not just about infelicities with respect to corruption, but it is also about the regularity and the presumption of order with respect to government's finances. And that's what we're trying to bring it back. And you ask me why we have the people that we are relying on. I want to thank my staff, both the public service as well as those within the cabinet, as well as those, the advisors, because people have been working beyond the call of duty to try and put us in this position. A normal IMF program, David, may take 9 months, 12 months. In Jamaica's case, it took 16 months. Barbados doesn't have the luxury of that time. And I think our people understood that we therefore needed to put ourselves in a position to minimize the difference in information and definition between ourselves and the fund. If there are going to be differences, there are going to be differences on policy. And we will argue out what our differences are. We say why we feel that the exchange rate must be preserved at all costs. We say why we feel that we ought to prioritize expenditure here rather than there. So, but a large part of the problem for us, and we're going to see it with Water Authority and other areas, has been the quality of the underlying data. It's just not there. So what we've inherited is a veritable nightmare, and I suspect that some of what you see from the Auditor General is the frustration with respect to a lot of that.
We had Integrity Group Barbados only today suggest that as an alternative to the PAC's parliamentarian composition, Barbados should consider comprising the committee with a body of unelected and non-partisan officials with the appropriate backgrounds. It sounds consistent with a lot that you have said in the past.
I have no difficulty with that.
About trying to reach out to more people.
I have no difficulty, and in fact, those are some of the things that we want to have a conversation on in terms of deepening people participation. There will be a commission on governance generally for deepening people participation that Ralph Thorne, I've asked him to chair it because, as you know, he's been a big proponent of local government. But local government for me is not necessarily the old-time local government that my grandfather was in. I feel, however, that you need to deepen the participation of people in things that affect them in their communities. Similarly,
you seem to have a bigger commitment to more government, because when I listened to some comments which you made last year as well, you spoke about
national MPs,
the national MPs and the extent to which the executive is so big that the parliament cannot be a check on the executive. Yet here you are with
you know the size of parliament in Bermuda?
No.
You know the size of population in Bermuda? I'll leave you to go and check that out. No. Because when you check it out, Bermuda is smaller than us. Look, government has become complex in these times. In 1966 or 1970, in fact, let's just go to Tom Adams. In Tom Adams' first administration, there was no reference to environment. Now, environment is the biggest issue that affects government, both in terms of land environment and marine environment. So that we have a government that spends $4 billion a year, but you want to complain about $1 million in a cabinet cost or $1 million in a parliament cost. I am saying to you, and I'm saying it at the end of my career, not the beginning, that it is my judgment that if we are to be truthful to the question of the difference in relation between the executive and the legislature, that rather than seeking to speak to what appears to be large, it's in fact small, that we need to make sure that the checks and balances are there. So that this is not a case of more government or less government, this is a case of effective government. And effective government will be cheaper than the runaway expenditure which we just saw in the last 5 years, and which I will lay and detail for you, because that's what happens when you don't have people coming to work to deal with the issues that we need to be advancing on a regular basis, or when you allow corruption and wastage to reign.
You refer to the Tom Adams administration. My recollection is that it was a relatively small cabinet, but
not for the times.
But what Barbados has been able to gain from that cabinet after all these years was significant. So sometimes it's not the size, it's the competence of the people.
And I believe that I have the competence of the people, and I've told you why I've structured the cabinet with respect to the mix of people.
I wasn't so much going back to the issue of the cabinet in that context.
But you know, this is an issue, David, that I ultimately am happy for the people of Barbados to make a judgment on.
Because you want to do referenda.
And not only just referenda, but I'm talking about the size of the cabinet issue. That while people spend all their time on it, you will forgive me if I don't spend a lot more time on it and focus on the substance of delivery.
I wasn't talking so much about that as I was looking at the composition of Parliament, and I've heard you articulate this concern about the strength of the executive versus, for instance, the backbench, and that there's no backbench. Here you are, winning all the seats, and
in circumstances where I have a country in serious, deep crisis. And therefore I've had to make the decisions in order to bring it back from crisis. Would I have liked to have won a government with a country in good shape? Of course. But what I've won is a government that let's deal with it. Sanitation, no trucks collecting garbage for how long? You know what they told me? Prime Minister, we start the day with 12 to 15 trucks and we end up the day with 6 to 8. Buses, same thing. We've seen how many buses collapse on the road, axles broken, this one break down. Let's go right on. The whole question of the economy, the whole question of pharmaceutical service. Decisions have been made with respect to the drug service that the Minister of Health is going to have to address very shortly to the country. So that when I say to you that we've literally inherited a government, CBC, $125 million in debt. When I start to show you the debt for each of the statutory corporations.
That's one side of it, Prime Minister. The other version of that is political survival. You don't want too many people out there who can make your life uncomfortable.
Really? Well, we already had one that went.
Only one.
So that doesn't bother me?
Only one.
And I could tell you that I think that we have, some people in your profession want to call it bloated. I would prefer to say that the country gave us a mandate that was very comfortable. So that's not the issue, because we have the capacity to be able to lose one or two. Look, you have to believe me at the end of my career, and I really am. And I've said to my party, and I can say it publicly, that if at the end of the day, in doing the right thing for Barbados, I am more unpopular than the party is, find a new leader. But I know this, that this country needs somebody to bat for it, because the country that I came into as a young parliamentarian is one that held its head high. And everywhere I go, people were asking in the last decade, you knew it too, what happened to Barbados? What's wrong? You had people like Charlie Sclee of blessed memory begging the government to take action. Delisle World, same thing, was there, begged them to take action, didn't. 18 months passed again. You can't have a country brought to its knees and then it's business as usual in terms of how you bring it to its knees. Carry the patient in the operating theatre and see what happens. Sometimes you've got to be operating on the heart, sometimes you're operating on something to do with the stomach, sometimes you're operating on something to do with some other part of the body.
Governance. And what this situation here with Reverend Atherley, Bishop Atherley, has shown us. What are the lessons learned here in terms of having him been elected on a BLP ticket, and only today he's saying he's leaving the BLP. His consultation is taking place after he took the job. I mean, from where you sit, what does this tell us? Because some people suspect that there's a conspiracy here.
No, there's no conspiracy. Look, I must tell you that one of the difficult things for me with this one was the extent. I perhaps spent more time in St. Michael West than most other constituencies for all kinds of reasons, day and night. And I've been there and the people have come to us and expressing, look, we voted for the party, we voted for you. I said, just hold tight. And I've given them all the assurance that in spite of Bishop Atherley moving from the party will represent the people of St. Michael West in the same way. So there will be no negative consequences for them. But it does raise the issue of trust and whether people who make a decision to vote in one way, in good faith, should within less than a week be confronted with a situation that what they thought they voted for is no longer what they did. And that's why others have called, and we talk about it in terms of constitutional reform and parliamentary reform, as to whether there shouldn't be a right of recall if there's a crossing of the floor. Trinidad has it. I believe in it. I support it. I've always done. But I support term limits too. A lot of people in my party don't. I believe that there should be no more than two terms of 5 years each for a Prime Minister at one time. And in fact, I feel at all times, there's some who would like it only and then to come back. I don't think so. I think that we are producing enough people in this country of capacity that 2 terms is more than enough to be able to do what you have to do and move off the scene. And these are some of the things that we will come to, but we don't have the luxury. I wish I had the luxury of dealing with some of these issues straight off the bat, because if I did, it would mean that I don't have the economic difficulties that we've inherited to deal with. And I trust and pray we will get to them within the next couple of months or the next year, 18 months. But one thing I'm sure is that I'm giving the country that I am given every ounce of my energy and my government's energy, first to stabilizing and securing the economy and to stabilizing the public health and the safety of the country, because that's what matters for the future. But we will get to these higher order governance issues, I hope, within a year, 18 months, because we feel that they're fundamental to the quality of democracy that we have. And the points that you made just now with respect to involving people beyond the elected class into the governance of the country.
Beyond the whole question of consulting with the people in a constituency, what other issues would you consider that this might have thrown up, this situation with Reverend Atherley? Any others?
No, I think that fundamentally, I mean, clearly what was offered to Reverend Atherley, Bishop Atherley, was not filling his eyes. And he felt strongly, as he says, that there needs to be an opposition to a government. I have to go by what he says. What I do know is that it is awkward and invidious for those who voted for somebody a few days earlier on one platform to hear that, and that perhaps they should have heard that before election day rather than after. So, I mean, look, there's nothing to be gained by reflecting on it. What is necessary is that when the time comes, the country has to recognize that are we not doing ourselves a disservice by allowing issues like this to fester rather than treating to the question of the right of recall on the crossing of the floor, as happens in other jurisdictions in the Commonwealth.
In the context of the question of referenda, what do you have as your number one item on the agenda?
Haven't settled it yet with the cabinet, so I'm not going to go out on a limb and tell you X, Y, Z. What we do know is that we are committed to those things that we feel are critical to the decision-making process of a government.
Such as?
Recreational marijuana, death penalty, euthanasia. And we've said that these are not things that no 30 people in a parliament will decide, that they must go to a referendum. Medical marijuana doesn't need to, because that follows where the science is, and the legislation already provides for part of it. But those are the things we will get to. But I must tell you, David, that when I say to you that I am almost singularly focused in protecting the country in this first phase, you must believe me, because it is critical that we settle and that we get back to a state of normalcy, that we know what the next 2.5 years will look like, and that we be able to access the balance of payment support that we need to protect the value of our dollar. That we be also able to allow government to become the things that government should be able to do. And part and parcel of the problem is that we've not been able to provide to education and health and to other areas of building social capital in the way that we should. I talked about youth programming and policy earlier, because we are trying to cover everything, because government has gone too far, too wide, and that it is all things to all people but serving nothing to anybody. And that's what we have to fix. But I look forward, believe you me, to dealing with some of the broader issues, because as we restructure government, we've already started the process of looking at growth, because part of the equation is debt, part of the equation is GDP, which is growth. And we recognize, and that's why we're not just speaking about the Hyatt or other projects, there are a whole raft of other projects that we need to make sure that we facilitate through the ease of doing business substantively, because we have to make sure that in the adjustment there is minimal separation, and that what you lose here you pick up here on the other hand, because there's significant economic activity coming to the country. And I must tell you that I look forward to speaking to the country in a different interview about the growth opportunities. We've had a number of good meetings with different types of people, and we're satisfied that there's a pipeline of projects that can come forward that will make a significant difference to Barbadians, some of which we've inherited and some of which are new.
Well, the final question is...
Is the final question?
How challenging has it been in this period?
It's been challenging. I mean, I think 7 out of every 10 people who approach me now tell me, you need to get rest, you need to get some sleep. And the truth is, what has been the most challenging for me, especially somebody that likes to interact as much as I do, that I don't think there are enough hours in a day to do that which is to be done. Because I know that we can do better, and I want to make sure that we can and will do better for our people. In the interim, there is a curve, there's a gestation period between now and getting there. It pleased my heart that the pensioners got their checks in the last week or so. You know, I mean, it's almost as if we've forgotten about it already. But those are the things, when we were told that it couldn't be done, what did I say? Give me the vote and watch me. No, keep watching me. Some you will like, some you may not, but I hope in all things we will act honorably, we will act with humility, that we will continue always to care, and above all else, we will put in the extra effort, because this country that is ours deserves it.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Prime Minister Mia Mottley.
Thank you.
I'm David Ellis. Do have a good evening.
Watching the first interview with the Honourable Mia Amor Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados. She's been talking with David Ellis, veteran journalist, on a wide range of issues. The Prime Minister has promised openness and transparency, and know that there will be many more of these moments where she gets to speak to the nation and the Barbadian public at large. I'm Joel Ford. Bye-bye.